They called it a wedding, but everyone in the pews knew it was a funeral for her youth. Lady Seraphina stood trembling at the altar, 22 years old and radiating fear. Beside her stood the Duke of Blackwood, 55, scarred and rumoured to have a heart as cold as the moors he ruled. Her own father had sold her to this beast to silence a scandal that wasn't even hers. She expected a life of misery in a cold, loveless castle. She expected to die inside. But she never expected that the monster she was forced to marry would be the only man to ever truly see her. This is the story of how a punishment became a salvation. October 14th, 1884, Grosvenor Square, London. The rain in London did not wash away sins. It merely made the cobblestones slick and dangerous, much like the society Lady Seraphina Fairchild found herself drowning in. Seraphina sat on the edge of her velvet chaise, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric of her dress. The door to her father's study was thick oak, yet the shouting penetrated it as if it were paper. "She is ruined, Reginald." Ruined, that was her uncle Silas. A man whose debts were as high as his moral ground was low. "I will not have the Fairchild name dragged through the gutter because of a dalliance with a stable boy," her father roared back. Seraphina closed her eyes, a single tear escaping. It was a lie. All of it. She had merely been seen handing a letter to the groom, Thomas, a letter of recommendation for another post, because Thomas was being dismissed unfairly. But Silas, needing a distraction from his own embezzlement charges, had spun a tale of a sordid affair. In Victorian London, the truth did not matter. Only the whisper mattered. And the whisper said Seraphina was soiled goods. The door flew open. Lord Reginald Fairchild, a man who loved his reputation more than his flesh and blood, stood in the frame. His face was purple with rage. "It is done," he spat, not looking her in the eye. "Pack your trunks, Seraphina. You leave for Yorkshire in the morning." "Yorkshire," she gasped, standing up. "Father, please." "I did nothing." Silence. He struck the doorframe with his cane. "You are fortunate I found a buyer at all. You are to marry the Duke of Blackwood." The heir left the room. The Duke of Blackwood. Alistair Blackwood. He was a legend, and not the kind young girls dreamed of. At 55, he was a recluse, living in the desolate north. The rumors were vicious. They said his first wife had vanished into the mist, never to be seen again. They said he was scarred, brutal, and hated the sight of joy. He was known as the Iron Duke, unbending, unfeeling, and terrifyingly powerful. He is old enough to be my grandfather," Seraphina whispered, horror gripping her throat. "And the rumors, father, they say he is cruel. He is rich," Reginald countered coldly. "And he is the only man in England powerful enough to ignore the stench of your scandal. He asked for a wife of breeding, regardless of reputation, to manage his estate. I offered you. He accepted. I am a punishment to him." "No," Reginald sneered, stepping closer. "He is the punishment for you. The journey north took 3 days. As the carriage ventured further from the smog of London and into the wild, grey expanses of Yorkshire, Serafina felt her life shrinking. The landscape became harsh, the trees gnarled and windblown. When Blackwood Manor finally loomed out of the fog, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. Stone gargoyles leered from the eaves, dripping with rain. The windows were dark, save for a single flickering light in the west wing. The carriage halted. The footman opened the door, his face pitying. "We have arrived, my lady." Serafina stepped onto the gravel. The wind bit through her cloak, chilling her to the bone. At the top of the massive stone steps stood a figure. He was tall, imposingly so. Even from this distance, his shoulders were broad, filling out a heavy charcoal greatcoat. He did not descend to greet her. He stood like a statue, watching her struggle up the stairs. As she reached the top, breathless and terrified, she finally saw him. Alistair Blackwood was not the monster the brochures of gossip had painted, but he was certainly not a prince. His hair was silver, thick and swept back, graying at the temples. His face was lined with the harsh geography of a life hard-lived, and a jagged scar ran from his jaw down into his collar, a souvenir from the Crimean War, she would later learn. But it was his eyes that froze her. They were steel grey, sharp, and devoid of any warmth. He looked at her not with lust, nor with kindness, but with the clinical appraisal of a man buying a horse. "You are smaller than I expected," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the stone floor. Serafina curtsied, her knees shaking. "Your Grace, you are cold," he observed flatly. He turned his back on her, walking into the shadowed hall. "Come inside. If you die of pneumonia before the wedding, the paperwork will be a nuisance." Serafina followed him into the dark, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her with the finality of a prison cell. The wedding was a sterile affair held in the private chapel of the manor 3 days later. No guests, no flowers, just the vicar who looked nervous and Mrs. Halloway, the stern housekeeper who served as a witness. When Alistair slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his hand was calloused and warm, a shocking contrast to his icy demeanor. He didn't look at her face, he looked at the ring, ensuring it fit. "I, Alistair, take thee, Serafina." He spoke the vows like a military report. Serafina whispered hers, fighting the urge to vomit. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. She belonged to the Iron Duke. That night she sat in the master bedroom, terrified. She wore a silk nightgown her mother had packed years ago for a future that was supposed to be happy. The fire in the grate popped, the only sound in the massive room. The door handle turned. Serafina stiffened, clutching the bedsheets. "This is it," she thought. "The part where I pay for the family name." Alistair entered. He had removed his coat and cravat, his white shirt unbuttoned at the top, revealing the start of the scar on his chest. He looked tired. He looked every day of his 55 years. He stopped at the foot of the bed, looking at her. She was trembling so violently, the bed frame rattled slightly. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and walked over to the side table to pour a glass of brandy. "Stop shaking, girl. You look like a rabbit waiting for the fox. I am doing my duty, your grace," she stammered. Alistair took a sip of the amber liquid, watching her over the rim of the glass. "Your duty? Is that what your father told you? That you must submit to the beast to redeem your honor?" Serafina lowered her eyes. "He said I was lucky you would have me." Alistair set the glass down with a sharp clink. He walked toward the bed. Serafina flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt the mattress dip as he sat down, not close to her, but at the edge. "Open your eyes, Serafina," she obeyed. He was looking at her, and for the first time, the steel in his eyes had softened just a fraction. "I am 55 years old," he said quietly. "I have buried a wife. I have buried soldiers. I have buried my own dreams long ago. I did not marry you to ravage you, and I certainly did not marry you to punish you." Serafina blinked, confused. "Then?" "Why, because this house is too big for a ghost," he muttered, almost to himself. Then his voice firmed up. "And because I owed your grandfather a debt. He saved my life in Sevastopol. When Reginald wrote to me, desperate to sell you off before he ruined you himself, I agreed. To get you out of that snake pit you call a home." Serafina was stunned. "You did it to save me. I did it to balance a ledger," he corrected sharply, standing up. "I do not require a lover, Serafina. I require a duchess. Someone to run the house, to organize the accounts, to ensure the tenants are fed. Can you do that, I?" "Yes. Yes, your grace. Good." He walked to the door. "I sleep in the east wing. You will be safe here. No one enters this room without your permission. Including me." He opened the door, then paused. "And Serafina, yes, my name is Alistair. Use it. Your grace makes me feel like I'm in court." With that, he left. Serafina sat alone in the silence. The fear began to ebb away, replaced by a bewildering curiosity. He wasn't the monster. He was a wall. A giant, impenetrable wall. But for the first time in months, behind that wall, she felt something she hadn't expected. Safe. 2 weeks later. Safety, however, did not mean warmth. Life at Blackwood Manor was lonely. Alistair was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days riding the estate or locked in his study. They ate dinner at opposite ends of a 30-foot table, the silence punctuated only by the scrape of silverware. He was polite but distant. He treated her like a lodger he was fond of but didn't want to disturb. Serafina, however, was not one to wither. She had a fire in her, the same fire that had gotten her into trouble in London. If she was to be the mistress of this house, she would act like it. She began with the staff. Mrs. Halloway was terrified of the Duke, and thus ran the house on a strictly utilitarian basis. No flowers, no music, no drapes open to let the sun in. Open them, Serafina commanded one Tuesday morning in the drawing room. But your grace, Mrs. Halloway stammered, the Duke prefers the dark. He says the sun hurts the books. The books are dead leather, Mrs. Halloway. I am alive. Open the curtains. Light flooded the dusty room, revealing rich tapestries that had been hidden in the gloom for decades. That evening, dinner was different. Serafina had ordered the table set not in the cavernous dining hall, but in the smaller, more intimate breakfast room near the fire. She wore a dress of deep crimson, not the drab greys she had arrived in. When Alistair walked in, he stopped dead. He looked at the smaller table, the fire, and then at her. What is this? He grumbled, tugging at his cuffs. The dining hall is draughty, Serafina said calmly, buttering a roll. And I got tired of shouting to ask how your day was. Sit, Alistair, he hesitated. For a moment, she thought he might storm out. But he sat. My day was adequate, he said stiffly. The tenant farms in the valley are flooded. I spent the afternoon digging drainage ditches with the men. Serafina paused. Are you digging ditches? I have two hands, do I not? He grunted. Most dukes would send a bailiff. I am not most dukes. He looked at her, his eyes catching the light of the fire. And you, it seems, are not most duchesses. You changed the drapes in the library. I did. I liked the old ones. They were moth-eaten and smelled of despair, she retorted. I burned them. Alistair stared at her. The silence stretched, tense and heavy. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. A sound rumbled in his chest, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. He was chuckling. Despair, he repeated, shaking his head. You are a bold creature, Serafina. I have nothing left to lose, Alistair. You already know the worst lies about me. I might as well be comfortable while I live them down. His expression sobered. He reached across the small table and poured wine into her glass. They are lies, he said firmly. I realized that 3 days ago when I saw you weeping over a dead sparrow in the garden. A woman capable of the deceit your father claimed would not cry for a bird. Serafina felt a lump in her throat. You watch me, it is my house, he said, taking a sip of wine, his eyes not leaving hers. I watch everything. The air between them shifted. It wasn't romantic, not yet. But the wall had a crack in it. But just as the first fragile root of trust began to take hold, the world outside Blackwood Manor decided to intervene. The next morning, a letter arrived. It was not for Serafina. It was for Alistair. He read it at the breakfast table, his face turning the color of ash. He crushed the paper in his fist, his knuckles cracking. What is it? Serafina asked, alarmed. Alistair stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. The darkness was back in his eyes, colder than before. Pack your things, he growled. What? Why, because, he snarled, looking at her with a mix of fury and something that looked painfully like regret. Your cousin Edmund is coming. And he brings a lawsuit claiming our marriage is invalid. On what grounds? She cried. Alistair threw the crumpled letter onto the table. "On the grounds that I am mentally unfit to manage my estate," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And that you, my dear, are the siren sent to manipulate a senile old man out of his fortune." The war for Blackwood had begun. The arrival of Edmund Fairchild was not an intrusion, it was an invasion. He did not come alone. 2 days after the letter arrived, a sleek black carriage, far too polished for the rugged Yorkshire roads, rattled through the iron gates of Blackwood Manor. Seraphina stood at the window of the drawing room, watching the vehicle approach. The rain had turned to sleet, peppering the glass, distorting the world outside into a grey smear. Behind her, Alistair paced. He had been pacing for 2 days, barely sleeping, his temper frayed to a thin, snapping wire. "He brings a lawyer," Alistair muttered, stopping to pour himself a third glass of whiskey, though it was barely noon. "And a physician. Dr. Aris. A man who specializes in nervous disorders of the aristocracy. He wants to prove you are mad," Seraphina said softly, turning to face him. "Because if you are mad, you cannot manage your estate. And if you cannot manage your estate, the crown appoints a steward. Or a next of kin. He is a distant cousin," Alistair growled. "He has no claim. He has a claim if he proves your wife is incompetent or complicit," she countered. "That is why he targeted me first. If I am a gold digger and you are a madman, the court will give him everything." The heavy oak doors groaned open. Mrs. Halloway appeared, her face pale. "Mr. Edmund Fairchild, Mr. Sterling, and Dr. Aris to see you, Your Grace." Edmund strode in before he was announced. He was a handsome man in a superficial way, blonde, smooth-skinned, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was everything Alistair was not, young, polished, and fundamentally hollow. "Cousin," Edmund boomed, spreading his arms as if expecting a hug. "And my dear Seraphina, you look pinched. Is the northern air treating you poorly?" Alistair did not move from the fireplace. He stood with one hand resting on the mantel, his knuckles white. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his scarred face, making him look more dangerous than ever. "State your business, Edmund," Alistair said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or get off my land." Mr. Sterling, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes, stepped forward, clutching a leather satchel. "Lord Blackwood, we are here on behalf of the High Court of Chancery. There have been concerns regarding the management of the Blackwood estate, and reports regarding your mental fortitude." "Reports?" Alistair laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "From whom?" "The sheep, from concerned family members," Edmund interjected smoothly, walking over to inspect a vase on a side table. "You dismissed 3 bailiffs in a month, Alistair. You were seen digging ditches in the rain, like a common labourer. You lock yourself in the West Wing for days. These are not the actions of a sane duke. They are the actions of a man who cares for his land," Seraphina snapped, stepping between Edmund and Alistair. Edmund looked at her, his smile turning condescending. "Oh, Seraphina, we know why you are here. My uncle Reginald, was quite clear. You were sent to soothe the beast. But a young girl cannot be expected to manage a man in the grip of melancholia. You are a victim here too, my dear. I am not a victim, Serafina declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. And my husband is not mad. He is efficient. He dismissed the bailiffs because they were stealing from the tenants. He dug the ditches because the village was flooding and the labor was short. That is not madness, Edmund. That is nobility. Alistair looked at her, startled. It was the first time anyone had defended him in decades. Dr. Arris, a small man with a notebook, cleared his throat. Nobility and mania often share the same face, Duchess. I am here to observe. If the Duke is sound of mind, he has nothing to fear. I shall stay for a week. You will not, Alistair roared, slamming his glass down. If you refuse the observation, Sterling said quietly, the court will issue an immediate order of incompetence. You will be removed from the property by force. The silence that followed was deafening. Alistair looked at the three men, his chest heaving. He was a war hero, a man who had led charges into cannon fire, yet here, in his own drawing room, he was cornered by paper and ink. He looked at Serafina. For a fleeting second, she saw pure terror in his eyes, the terror of a man losing his agency. Fine, Alistair hissed. Stay. But if you cross me, Doctor, I will show you exactly how mad a Blackwood can be. He stormed out of the room. Edmund watched him go, then turned to Serafina with a smirk. Don't worry, cousin. Once he is in the asylum, we'll see about getting you a nice cottage in the Cotswolds. Far away from this gloom, Serafina walked up to him until she was inches from his face. If you think I will let you destroy him for a few acres of land, Edmund, you have vastly underestimated the Fairchild's stubbornness. She turned and followed her husband, leaving the vultures in the drawing room. But as she walked down the hall, she knew the battle had only just begun. They were inside the walls now. The week of observation was a slow, agonizing torture. Dr. Arris was a shadow. He sat in the corner of the library while Alistair tried to work. He took notes when Alistair ate. He asked probing, insidious questions about the war, about Alistair's first wife, about his sleep. Do you often hear voices, Your Grace? Arris asked one evening over dinner. I hear the voice of a man asking stupid questions, Alistair replied, not looking up from his. Zub. Hostility, Arris muttered, scribbling in his notebook. Sign of persecution mania. Serafina watched Alistair crumble. The Iron Duke was rusting under the pressure. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He began to doubt his own mind. The presence of the doctor made him self-conscious of every tick, every scar, every memory. On the fourth night, a storm battered the manor. The wind howled through the chimneys like a dying animal. Serafina woke to a crash. She sat up, heart pounding. The sound had come from the library. She grabbed her robe and a candle, rushing down the dark corridor. When she pushed open the library door, she found chaos. A heavy bust of Caesar lay shattered on the floor. Books were pulled from the shelves. And in the center of the room, Alistair was crouched on the rug, his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth. "The cannons," he was whispering, his voice cracked and childlike. "They won't stop." Why won't they stop? It was the war. The storm outside sounded like artillery. Serafina froze. If Dr. Aris saw this, if Edmund saw this, it was over. They would lock him away forever. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Edmund. She acted on instinct. She slammed the library door shut and locked it. Then she ran to Alistair. "Alistair," she hissed, dropping to her knees beside him. She grabbed his wrists, pulling his hands away from his ears. "Alistair, look at me." His eyes were wide, unseeing. He was back in Crimea, in the mud and the blood. "They are coming over the ridge." "I can't find my rifle." "You are not in Crimea," Serafina said firmly, cupping his rough, scarred face in her hands. "You are in Yorkshire. You are in the library. I am Serafina. I am your wife." The footsteps stopped outside the door. The handle rattled. "Alistair," Edmund's voice came through the wood. "Is everything all right in there?" I heard a crash. Alistair flinched violently, a whimper rising in his throat. Serafina pressed her forehead against his, her hair falling around them like a curtain. "Quiet," she whispered fiercely. "You are the Iron Duke. You are strong. Do not let them win. Breathe with me." She inhaled deeply. Alistair, caught in her gaze, mimicked her. His breathing was ragged, terrified. "Serafina," Edmund called again, louder. "Open this door." "Just a moment, cousin," Serafina called back, her voice steady and annoyed. "I dropped a stack of books." "Go back to bed." "Is Alistair in there?" Alistair was trembling. Serafina moved her hand to the back of his neck, her thumb stroking the tension there. "Look at me," she whispered. "You are safe. I have you. I will not let them take you." Something in his eyes shifted. The grey fog of the flashback receded, replaced by a desperate, piercing clarity. He saw her. He saw the woman who had been sold to him as a punishment, now acting as his shield. "Serafina," he choked out. "Stand up," she commanded gently. "Pour a brandy. Sit in the chair." "Be the Duke," Alistair nodded, shaky but compliant. He hauled himself up. He smoothed his hair. He sat in his leather wingback chair and picked up a book. Serafina unlocked the door. Edmund and Dr. Aris stood there, lanterns raised. They looked past her, hungry for a scene of madness. Instead, they saw the Duke of Blackwood sitting by the fire, reading a treatise on agriculture, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. "Is there a reason you are interrupting my reading, gentlemen?" Alistair asked. His voice was rough but steady. Edmund looked at the shattered bust on the floor. The wind blew the window open. Serafina lied effortlessly, gesturing to the heavy velvet drapes she had quickly pulled aside. "It knocked over the bust." I was just cleaning it up. Dr. Aris narrowed his eyes, looking from the broken stone to Alastair. You seemed distressed, Your Grace. I am distressed by the draft, Alastair said coldly. Good night. Edmund lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting between Seraphina and Alastair. He sensed something had happened, but he had missed it. With a sneer, he turned and left. When the door clicked shut, Alastair slumped in the chair, the facade breaking. He buried his face in his hands. They almost had me, he whispered. Seraphina walked over to him. She didn't stand across the desk this time. She sat on the arm of his chair. Tentatively, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Alastair turned into her touch. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the silk of her robe. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. Why did you do that? He mumbled into her side. You could have let them take me. You would be free. You would be rich. I don't want to be free, Seraphina said softly, her fingers carding through his silver hair. I want to be here. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. I am 55 years old, Seraphina. I am broken. I have nightmares that make me weep like a child. I am not a husband. I am a burden. You are the only man who has ever treated me with respect, she replied. My father sold me. My uncle lied about me. The boys in London laughed at me. You gave me a home. You gave me a voice. Alastair reached up, his calloused thumb tracing her lower lip. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a month of unspoken tension. I tried to hate you, he confessed. I tried to keep you out. But you walked into this tomb and you lit the fires. He pulled her down. It wasn't a ravishment, it was a desperate collision. He kissed her with the hunger of a starving man, and she kissed him back with all the defiance of her youth. In that library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the storm outside, the arrangement became a marriage. But even as they found solace in the dark, the light of morning brought a new, sharper knife. The morning after the storm, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The servants moved quietly. Edmund and Dr. Aris were smug. They didn't need to see the madness. They just needed to provoke it one last time before the hearing, which was scheduled in 3 days in the local township. But Edmund had a backup plans. He knew he couldn't rely solely on Dr. Aris's notes. He needed to break the alliance between the Duke and Duchess. Breakfast was tense. Seraphina and Alastair sat close together, a united front. Alastair looked tired, but the haunted look was gone, replaced by a steely determination. He reached for the butter, his hand brushing Seraphina's. A silent communication passed between them. We will survive this. Edmund watched this interaction and smiled. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. I received a fascinating letter from London this morning, Edmund said casually. From your father, Seraphina. Uncle Reginald, Seraphina froze. My father does not write to me, No, he writes to me. We have been collaborating. Edmund slid the letter across the long table. It stopped in front of Alastair. Don't read it, Alastair, Seraphina said quickly, a cold pit forming in her stomach. It's a trick. Read it, Your Grace, Edmund urged. I think you'll find it illuminating regarding the terms of your purchase. Alastair hesitated, then picked up the letter. As he read, his face drained of color. The warmth that had been there only moments ago evaporated, replaced by the icy mask of the Iron Duke. Is this true? Alastair whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. What does it say? Seraphina asked, reaching for it. Alastair snatched it away. He looked at her with a look of betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. Your father writes that you were instructed to humor my moods, Alastair read, his voice dead. That you were to keep me calm and compliant until the papers could be drawn up to transfer the estate to your future son, or to a regent if I was incapacitated. He says you wrote to him last week saying, the beast is softening. I have him in hand, Seraphina gasped. I never wrote that. I haven't written to my father since. I arrived. It is in your handwriting, cousin, Edmund lied smoothly. Uncle Reginald sent the copy. It's a forgery, Seraphina cried, standing up. Alastair, look at me. You know I wouldn't, do I? Alastair stood up, towering over her. I know you are an actress, Seraphina. You played the part of the dutiful wife well. You played the part of the lover even better last night. Was that part of the plan? Seduce the old fool to make sure he trusts you before you sign him away? No, tears streamed down her face. Alastair, last night was real. I love you, love, Alastair laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Who could love this? A scarred, broken old man. Do not insult my intelligence, madam. You are young, beautiful, and ambitious. Of course, you don't love me. You love the title. You love the money. That isn't true. Get out, Alastair said, his voice dropping to a whisper. What? Get out of my sight. Go to your room. Pack your things. Alastair, please. I said G.O., he roared, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the silverware jumped. Seraphina recoiled. She looked at Edmund, who was sipping his tea with a satisfied smirk. She looked at Alastair, whose eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain. He had shut down. The walls were back up, higher and thicker than ever. He believed the lie because he hated himself too much to believe the truth, that someone could actually love him. She turned and ran from the room, her sobs echoing in the stone hallway. Edmund chuckled. Well handled, Alastair. Better to cut the rot out now before it spreads. Alastair turned his gaze on Edmund. It was the look of a wolf who had been caught in a trap and was ready to chew off its own leg to kill the hunter. Do not speak to me, Alastair said, his voice devoid of humanity. You have your show. You have your proof of my instability. Now leave me. Alastair walked to the window and watched the rain. He had done it. He had driven her away. He believed the letter was likely a lie, deep down, he knew Reginald was a snake. But he also knew that as long as Serafina stayed with him, she would be dragged into the mud of this lawsuit. She would be branded the wife of a madman. By making her leave, by making her hate him, he was saving her. It was the only gift he had left to give. But upstairs, Serafina was not packing. She was pacing. She wiped the tears from her face. She looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the girl who had arrived terrified 2 months ago. That girl was gone. "He thinks he can push me away," she whispered to her reflection. "He thinks he is saving me." She grabbed her cloak. She wasn't leaving the manor. She was going to the village. She was going to the telegraph office. She needed to find the one person who could expose Edmund's lie. She needed to find the groom, Thomas, the boy whose affair had started this whole mess. The Iron Duke had given up. But the Duchess had just begun to fight. The courtroom in the village of Haworth was a stifling, wood-paneled box that smelled of damp wool and judgment. It was packed. The scandal of the Mad Duke had drawn every tenant, shopkeeper, and gossip within 20 miles. Rain lashed against the high windows, a fitting accompaniment to the gloomy proceedings. Alistair sat in the defendant's dock. He wore his best suit, a severe black frock coat, but he looked like a man already condemned. He stared at his hands, folded neatly in his lap. He had not spoken a word since arriving. He had not looked at the gallery. He believed Serafina was gone, on a train to London, escaping the wreckage of his life. He was ready to let them take everything, as long as she was safe from the fallout. Judge Thornton, a man with a wig that looked like a bird's nest and a face like a dried apple, banged his gavel. "Order," he croaked. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your closing arguments regarding the competency of the Duke." Sterling stood up, adjusting his spectacles. He looked like a smug undertaker. "My lord," Sterling began, pacing before the bench, "we have established a clear pattern. The digging of ditches in the mud like a peasant. The violent outbursts against staff. The broken statuary. And finally, the testimony of Dr. Arris, confirming severe melancholia and persecution mania. The Duke is not merely eccentric, he is a danger to himself and the economic stability of the region. We petition that stewardship be granted to his nearest male relative, Mr. Edmund Fairchild." Edmund sat in the front row, looking appropriately somber. He dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief, playing the part of the grieving cousin to perfection. "Does the defense wish to speak?" Judge Thornton asked, looking at Alistair. Alistair stood slowly. The room went silent. He looked at the judge, his grey eyes weary. "I have no defense, my lord," Alistair said, his voice rough but clear. "If caring for my land makes me mad, then I am mad. If grieving my past makes me unfit, then I am unfit. I only ask that the court ensure the dower portion for my wife, Serafina, remains untouched. She is innocent of my condition." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. Even in his defeat, He was protecting her. Edmund hid a smile behind his hand. It was working perfectly. Very well, the judge sighed, reaching for his gavel. In light of the uncontested evidence, I am prepared to rule in favor of the plaintiff. Bang. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom flew open, slamming against the walls with a sound like a gunshot. Every head turned. Serafina stood in the doorway. She was drenched. Her hair was plastered to her face, her cloak heavy with rain, and her chest was heaving from running. She looked wild, furious, and magnificent. "I object," she screamed, her voice cutting through the humid air. "Order," the judge shouted, banging his gavel. "Who is this woman?" "I am the Duchess of Blackwood." Serafina marched down the center aisle, water dripping from her hem onto the floorboards. She ignored the gasps of the crowd. She ignored Edmund, who had turned pale. She looked only at Alastair. He was staring at her as if he was seeing a ghost. "Serafina, you left." "I did not leave," she said fiercely, stopping at the railing of the dock. "I went to find the truth." She turned to the judge. "My lord, you are about to make a grave error based on lies and forgery. This is highly irregular," Sterling sputtered, jumping up. The Duchess is clearly distraught. Perhaps she is suffering from the same hysteria as her husband. "The only hysteria here is your fear of being caught, Mr. Sterling," Serafina snapped. She pulled a sheaf of damp papers from her cloak. "I have here a telegram from London. From the Fairchild family solicitor, Mr. Bramley. A man my cousin Edmund owes £4,000 to in gambling debts." Edmund stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "This is preposterous." "She is lying. Sit down," the judge roared. He looked at Serafina with interest. "Continue, Your Grace. Edmund Fairchild is not here to save the estate," Serafina declared, her voice ringing out. "He is here to liquidate it. He has debts all over London. And to get this estate, he needed to prove my husband was mad. He needed to prove I was a manipulator." She held up the letter, the one Edmund had produced at breakfast. "He claimed this letter was from my father, stating I was plotting against the Duke. But look at the date." She slammed the paper onto the judge's bench. "October 14th. My father was in Paris on October 14th. He could not have posted this from London. And the handwriting. I have a letter here from my father actually written in October. Compare the signatures." The judge put on his spectacles. He looked at the two papers. He squinted. Then he looked at Edmund. "Mr. Fairchild," the judge said slowly, "the loops on the R are significantly different. And the postmark. Indeed, this letter was posted from a station in Yorkshire. The very station you arrived at." The courtroom erupted. "It's a forgery," someone shouted from the back. "Silence," the judge hammered the bench. Serafina wasn't finished. She turned to Dr. Aris, who was trying to shrink into his seat. "And you, doctor," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Did you note in your ledger that the violent outburst in the library happened during a thunderstorm? That my husband, a veteran of the Crimean War, was suffering from a memory of battle? Or did you conveniently leave that out to make him sound like a lunatic? I merely observed. Aris stammered. You observed a hero in pain and called it madness, Seraphina cried. She turned back to Alastair. He was gripping the railing, his knuckles white. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her. The despair was gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of wonder, of awe. And as for the digging of ditches, Seraphina said, her voice softening as she addressed the crowd. My husband was not playing in the mud. He was clearing the drainage for the Miller farm because old Mr. Miller has a bad back. Is there a law against a duke having a heart? Is there a law against a man caring for his people? No, shouted a farmer from the gallery. God bless the Duke, God bless the Iron Duke, another voice cried. The courtroom dissolved into chaos, but this time it was a chaos of support. The judge banged his gavel one last time. Mr. Sterling, unless you have concrete proof to counter these accusations of fraud, I am dismissing this petition with prejudice. And I am ordering the constable to detain Mr. Fairchild for questioning regarding attempted fraud and forgery. Edmund tried to run. He bolted for the side door, but the bailiff, a burly man who had once served under Alastair, grabbed him by the collar and hauled him back. Case dismissed, the judge ruled. Seraphina slumped against the railing, the adrenaline leaving her. She felt dizzy. Suddenly, strong arms were around her. Alastair had vaulted over the dock railing. He caught her before she fell. I've got you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I've got you. The carriage ride back to Blackwood Manor was a journey through a world transformed. Outside, the storm that had raged during the trial was finally breaking. The relentless drumming of rain against the roof slowed to a rhythmic patter, and the heavy grey clouds began to fracture, allowing thin, pale shafts of afternoon light to pierce the gloom of the moors. Inside the carriage, the air was thick, charged with the electricity of things left unsaid. Alastair sat opposite Seraphina, his large frame filling the space. He had removed his heavy charcoal frock coat the moment they stepped inside, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. Now he sat in his shirt sleeves, the white linen stark against the dark leather of the seats. He watched her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. He didn't speak, but his eyes, usually so guarded, so cold, were wide and searching. He looked like a man who had woken up on the edge of a cliff, only to find he hadn't fallen. Seraphina huddled into the warmth of his coat, the scent of him, tobacco, rain, and old paper enveloping her. She watched his hands. They were resting on his knees, clenched so tight the knuckles were white. These were the hands that had dug ditches for his tenants. The hands that had held a rifle in Crimea. The hands that had trembled when he thought he was losing his mind. Tentatively, she reached out across the small space and placed her hand over his. His reaction was immediate. He turned his hand over and gripped hers, his calloused fingers interlocking with hers as if she were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. He pulled her slightly, urging her to move from her seat to the one beside him. She didn't hesitate. She moved to his side, and he wrapped a heavy arm around her, pulling her flush against his chest. "You are freezing," he murmured, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I don't feel the cold," she whispered, resting her head against his shoulder. "Not anymore." When the carriage finally rattled over the gravel of the manor's driveway, the house that loomed before them no longer looked like a fortress of solitude. It looked like a sanctuary. The staff was waiting on the steps. Mrs. Holloway, usually the picture of stoic efficiency, was openly weeping, clutching a handkerchief to her chest. The footmen, the maids, the groundskeeper, they all stood in a ragged line, their faces beaming with relief. They had heard the verdict. The Iron Duke had not fallen. Alistair helped Serafina down, his grip firm on her elbow. As Mrs. Holloway rushed forward to take the wet coat, Alistair waved her off gently. "I have her, Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Prepare a bath, hot enough to scald, and bring tea to the library. I will tend to my wife, my wife." The words hung in the air, possessive and proud. He led her through the great hall, not to her separate chambers in the west wing, but directly to the library, the heart of the house, the place where he had almost broken, and the place where she had saved him. He sat her in his own leather wingback chair near the roaring fire. He knelt before her, disregarding the dignity of his station, and began to chafe her cold hands between his own warm ones. The firelight danced across the scar on his jaw, softening the jagged line until it looked less like a wound and more like a mark of survival. "Why?" he asked finally, the question tearing out of him. He looked up at her, his grey eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that stole her breath. "I told you to go, Serafina. I gave you a way out. I made myself the villain so you could leave without guilt. You could have been free of me. You could have been rich, young, and free." Serafina looked down at him, her heart aching for the man beneath the title. She reached out, her fingers tracing the silver hair at his temples. "Do you really think so little of me, Alistair?" she asked softly. "Do you think I am like Edmund? That I see people as stepping stones? That I see marriage as a transaction?" "No," Alistair shook his head, his voice cracking. "I know you are not like him. That is the problem. You are light, Serafina. You are vibrant. You are spring. And I..." He gestured to himself, to his scarred face and his graying hair. "I am winter. I am 55 years old. I have ghosts in my head that scream when the thunder rolls. I have buried a wife. I have buried soldiers. I have buried every dream I ever had. I couldn't bear the thought of dragging you into my grave with me." He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I thought if I made you hate me, I would be saving you. I thought I was protecting you from the burden of loving a broken man. I don't want a savior, Alistair," she said firmly, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to look at her. "And I certainly don't want a young, foolish husband who knows nothing of the world's cruelty. I want the man who dug a ditch in the rain to save a farmer's harvest. I want the man who married a disgraced girl to save her reputation when her own father sold her." Tears welled in Alistair's eyes, spilling over to track through the lines of his face. I want the man who tries to hide his pain because he thinks he has to be strong for everyone else, she continued, her voice fierce. You didn't ruin me, Alistair. You woke me up. Everyone else in London saw a scandal. They saw a ruined woman. You were the only one who looked at me and saw a person. You gave me a home. You gave me a voice. Alistair closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. I have loved you since the moment you yelled at Mrs. Halloway about the curtains, he confessed, a broken laugh escaping his chest. I was terrified. I thought, who could love this? Who could love a beast? You are. Not a beast, she whispered, brushing her lips against his cheek. You are just a man who has been lonely for too long. I see you, Seraphina, he breathed, pulling her down from the chair until she was on the rug with him, wrapped in his arms. I see nothing else, he kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate, frantic kiss of the night of the storm, nor the polite, cold peck of their wedding day. It was slow, deep, and deliberate. It was a kiss that tasted of rain, of relief, and of a promise that would outlast the stone walls of the manor. It was the kiss of a man who had finally put down his armor and allowed himself to be human. In the warmth of the library, with the storm fading outside, the arrangement ended and the true marriage began. 5 years later, the summers in Yorkshire were brief, but when they arrived, they were glorious. The gardens of Blackwood Manor, once a dreary expanse of grey stone and overgrown weeds, were now a riot of colour. Roses climbed the trellis, lavender perfumed the air, and the great lawn was a carpet of vibrant green. Alistair Blackwood sat on a stone bench overlooking the valley. He was 60 years old now. His hair had turned completely white, gleaming in the sun, but his back was straight, and the dark circles that had once haunted his eyes were gone. The lines on his face remained. He would always be a man who had seen too much, but they had softened, crinkling at the corners in a way that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. He held a book of poetry in his lap, a gift from Seraphina, but he wasn't reading. His attention was entirely captivated by the scene on the lawn. A small boy, barely 4 years old with unruly black curls and bright grey eyes, was running in circles, shrieking with laughter as he was chased by a large, bounding golden retriever. "Papa! Papa, look!" the boy shouted, tripping over his own feet and tumbling into the grass, only to roll over giggling. "I'm faster than Buster." Seraphina walked out onto the terrace, carrying a tray of lemonade. She wore a dress of pale yellow, bright and cheerful, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked radiant, possessing a confidence that had only grown since that day in the courtroom. She set the tray down and sat beside Alistair, resting her head on his shoulder. Alistair immediately wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. His hand, still strong and warm, rested protectively on her waist. "He has your energy," Alistair noted, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest as he watched their son wrestle the dog. "And your stubbornness," Seraphina countered with a smile, looking up at him. "He refused to wear his coat this morning because he said the Duke never gets cold." Alistair laughed, the sound rich and uninhibited. "He will learn. Even dukes get cold without their Duchess." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the legacy they had built. The rumors in London still swirled occasionally, whispers about the young beauty and the old duke, about the scandal that had started it all. But those whispers could not reach them here. They were insulated by the walls of a home that was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary of life. "Are you happy, Alistair?" Serafina asked, a question she often asked when the days were this perfect, as if she still needed to reassure the ghost of the man he used to be. Alistair looked at the boy, who was now trying to explain the concept of fetch to the dog. He looked at the rolling hills of the estate he had fought to keep. And finally, he looked at the woman who had walked into his darkness and lit a fire that refused to go out. He kissed her temple, lingering there. "No, Serafina, I am not happy," he said softly, his voice filled with a profound peace. "Happiness is fleeting. I am something far better, and what is that? I am complete." The Iron Duke had finally found his mercy, not in the silence of solitude, but in the chaotic, messy, beautiful noise of a life shared with the only woman who had ever dared to love him. And that, my friends, is the story of Serafina and Alistair. It's a reminder that true love doesn't look like a fairy tale at first glance. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a storm, hidden behind scars and disguised as a punishment. Alistair thought his life was over at 55, that he was destined to be alone. But Serafina showed him, and the world, that it's never too late to fight for someone who sees the real you. The world tried to tear them apart with lies, age gaps, and greed, but they stood back to back and fought for their happily ever after. It proves that a monster is often just a man who needs to be loved, and a victim can be the strongest warrior of all. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. What did you think of Serafina's bravery in the courtroom? Would you have stayed and fought for Alistair? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss another dramatic romance story. Type true love in the comments if you believe love has no age limit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.